Dracula.
I don't think I need to tell you that Dracula is famous. Ask 50 random people if they had seen the 1931 film starring Bela Lugosi, and all of them, with the rare exception of one or two, might tell you that they have never seen the film or that they don't even know who's Bela Lugosi or Todd Browning. But ask those 50 people what do they think of when they hear that name, Dracula, and wouldn't you believe it, they bring up pale faces, black lips, dark capes and a thick Romanian accent. All are traits of the 1931 film by Universal Pictures. But why? How did we get here? Why does a movie from 90 years ago influence how we see a character with so many representations throughout the years? You might say we're going to go on the road to Dracula, but someone already called dibs on that name. But all jokes aside, we're going to examine everything that made the 1931 film what it is today. We're exploring the idea, the essence you might even say, of what is Dracula. So let's start where all good horror stories do, with a 19th century penny dreadful. From 1845 to 1847, the story of Varney the Vampire, or Feast of Blood, was released in serial form through cheap pamphlets known as penny dreadfuls and eventually as a book in 1847. It is attributed to James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Becket Prest, and while not much is known about it, it is arguably the first appearance of vampires in popular culture and would highly influence following vampire stories in the mainstream. In that same year, 1847, in Dublin, someone very important to our story was born, a man by the name of Bram Stoker. Though he is most famous today for his literary work, Stoker was not a professional author. He worked as a business manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London's West End and as an assistant for actor Henry Irving. In fact, Stoker has never even been to Transylvania, but he did have a great fascination with the town of Whitby and its ancient cemetery, where a lot of the book takes place. Despite popular belief, Stoker has already outlined his book when he heard about Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula, and the inspiration was only the name. Now, this is a review of the book that appeared on The Guardian in 1897. Now, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but there is one line that is particularly amusing to me in the context of this video. The plot is too complicated for reproduction. In other words, this material is not fit for any adaptation because the plot is too complicated. Despite these words, the first attempt at an authorized adaptation was actually by Stoker himself. So remember that Stoker worked for this actor named Henry Irving? Well, he was actually the inspiration for the character of Dracula. He was allegedly a boss from hell who, much like Dracula, lived off of the energy and life of others. Stoker wanted to turn his book into a play and for Irving to play the Count. But Henry walked out of a reading at the Lyceum after calling the text dreadful. Stoker died in 1912 and never got to see his work adapted in any way. Before we jump into the play and the movie and all that, I want to briefly mention two unauthorized adaptations. The first was an Austrian film called Dracula's Death and was more like Phantom of the Opera. It told the story of a music teacher that believes he is immortal and gets sent to an asylum where he feeds off the blood of the other patients. The film was lost and never recovered. The second, and much more famous one, was Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror. The film followed the original novel much more closely than Dracula's Death did, but it had to change some plot elements and character names, and yet Bram Stoker's widow sued Piranha Films, the small German company that made the film, and they had to burn every single copy of the movie. But fortunately, a few of the copies did survive, and the film is now regarded as a silent classic. Now let's get back to the authorized adaptations. In 1924, Irish playwright and actor Hamilton Dean created the play which was the first sign of how we imagine Dracula today. The evening clothes and the European accent all came from that play. Originally, Dean wanted to play Dracula, but then realized Van Helsing had all of the best speeches, so he played him instead. The play was also what made Hollywood executives believe in the idea of Dracula. One of the reasons the book wasn't really adapted in America was because making a faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel would require a very big budget and a rather long runtime. And here was an adaptation that was like the zero-calories version of the book. It gave you everything you needed, but was much tighter and appealed to a larger audience. The play was a great success, so naturally, it transferred to Broadway in 1927. There was just one problem. The opening date was approaching and every part in the show was cast except for the most important one, the Count. Now, even though the play in London was a success, the budget was pretty tight. Fortunately for them, a young immigrant named Bela Lugosi really wanted the role and wasn't too picky when it came to his payment. The only problem was that Lugosi had a bit of a hard time when it came to speaking and understanding English, so he was actually directed in French in the play. In one night of the show's run on Broadway, one man in the audience was very important to our story. One man by the name of Carl Laemmle. It might be a surprise to you that even after a track record of successful films like Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, late 1920s Universal wasn't particularly interested in horror movies. The reason for that might have been the head of the studio at the time, Carl Laemmle. You see, Universal was interested in making an adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, but Carl's son and producer of the film, Carl Laemmle Jr., wanted to make a big and lavish production that was more faithful to the book, but would have left the studio bankrupt. But again, Dean's play made Carl realize that you can tell the story of the novel in a way that was possible from a budget standpoint. And so, after negotiation with Dean and other movie studios like Fox and Columbia, Universal bought the film rights for $40,000 or $784,000 in today's money in the summer of 1930. Despite that, the film was still made at a pretty big budget of $341,000 or about $6.6 million in today's money. So now, with the rights in hand, Carl Laemmle, his son, and the director Todd Browning had to face the same problem the play had: finding the right count. Austrian actor Conrad Veidt was considered, mostly because of his performances in German expressionist films like his role as the vampire-like character Cesar in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Carl Laemmle apparently insisted that Lon Chaney would play the Count, which made sense because, though Chaney was hard to work with, his films with Universal made a lot of money. In fact, Chaney signed a 3-movie contract with Universal, which also included a talking sequel to Phantom of the Opera. But Chaney was terminally ill with cancer and died in 1930. So, finally, Universal cast Lugosi for the same reason they first denied him the part. Because he wasn't a big star, it meant he will be willing to sign up for the cheap payment of $500 or about $9,800 today per week for 7 weeks of filming. For the camera, Karl Freund, known for his work on German silent films like Metropolis, was chosen. Freund was a pioneer of the moving camera, unlike his director Todd Browning, who was more used to a static camera, which resulted in a shot like this being minutes apart from a shot like this. In fact, David Manners, the actor who played Jonathan Harker, does not remember Browning's presence on the set, but does remember Freund's. He even recalls that he got most of his directions from him. Because the film was made in the time of the Great Depression, some corners had to be cut. For example, the shots of the Dimitri, the ship that brings Dracula and Renfield to London, were taken from the 1925 silent film The Stormbreaker, which is why it looks sped up, since silent films were projected at a different speed than talking ones. Also, the film didn't have an original soundtrack, which was quite common at the time. The only music that was in films was in the opening titles and as diegetic music, like say in a concert. Now, even though Dracula was talky, it didn't mean everyone already adjusted to this new format. Some theaters weren't equipped with sound systems, and what about foreign markets who wanted to hear the films in their languages? So, in 1931, 3 official versions of Dracula were released. The first was the English-speaking talkie starring Bela Lugosi and directed by Todd Browning. The second was a silent version that had title cards for theaters that weren't equipped with sound systems. And the third, which I will now discuss, was the Spanish version starring Carlos Villarreal and directed by George Melford. Now, this is how it worked. Every day, the English crew would come on, film the scenes, and then the Spanish crew would look at what the English crew shot and film their own scenes. A lot of people consider the Spanish version superior, and there are a few reasons for that. One of them being that censorship was not quite as a threat with foreign language films as it was with English-speaking ones, so it allowed the Spanish version to have stuff like rats, which made it closer to the book. Despite it including more than its English-speaking counterpart, the Spanish version was made at a budget of only $66,000, or around $1.2 million today. One way money was saved in the Spanish version was the use of alternative takes with Lugosi. Back to the English-speaking version, it actually has a few records to its name. The first, and most obvious one, was that it was the first ever talking supernatural thriller. But apparently it also had the first ever female vampire on film, played by Geraldine Dvorak. It also had the first ever recorded on-screen impersonation of Bela Lugosi's Dracula, performed by Helen Chandler. When the film released, it was a great success and apparently sold 50,000 tickets in the first 48 hours, which grew to a box office earning of $700,000, or about $13.7 million adjusted to inflation. As for the critics, they loved it, with the New York Times praising the performances and direction. Over the years, the film made Universal a lot of money, especially in the home video industry, which was supported by yours truly. In the year 2000, the film was added to the Library of Congress's National Film Registry, with the Spanish version getting the same treatment in 2015. Since the film didn't have an original soundtrack, one was written by Philip Glass, performed by the Crumbs Quartet, and was added to every subsequent home video release of the film since 1999. Browning made one more film for Universal before making the box office bomb Freaks for MGM. He made his final film, Miracles for Sale, in 1939, and then lived a rather peaceful life in Malibu until his death in 1962. After Dracula, Lugosi was only cast in that kind of role, though his role in Son of Frankenstein for, ironically Universal, proved his versatility. He became addicted to painkillers and made news on cheap newspapers when he was seeking treatment for his addiction. In the same year, 1955, he enjoyed a slight comeback when Dracula was aired on TV, but he died in 1956, taking one of his capes to the grave. So let me ask you this. What do you think of when you hear that name, Dracula? Perhaps a cape, a thick accent, and, well, I'll let Helen do the rest of the talking.
Two red eyes staring at me, and a white, livid face, and then it's